friends, and welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. It's a third Before You Read lecture related to the book of Ezekiel. This lecture will focus on Ezekiel chapter 17 through 24. As a brief recap, this is the final third, really, of the opening 24 chapters in Ezekiel. And these chapters, for the most part, there's some divergences from this pattern, but it's generally a word of judgment, God's word of judgment to the people of Israel, to the city of Jerusalem in particular, a little bit about Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom, which at the time when Ezekiel is writing has already fallen. And remember that much of Ezekiel is written with the Babylonian exile about to happen, or Babylon seems to be literally surrounding the city of Jerusalem. The message and the situation are both dire, and I think that that's an important thing for us to keep in mind as we continue to journey with Ezekiel. I want to hold up as a sort of introductory metaphor, something that I've mentioned in several occasions, and it is the image of Jacob wrestling with the angel of God in the book of Genesis. And you might remember this story that Israel, or Jacob, as he's called there, wrestles with this angel, and he says, "I'm not going to let go of you until you bless me." And it's this great sort of struggle of the human versus the angel. And eventually, he is blessed by the angel of God. And I often think that when we encounter difficult biblical texts, we have to have a similar disposition as Jacob. We have to wrestle with the text. We have to sort of get our hands dirty. We have to be made uncomfortable, all in the hopes and sort of in our heart of hearts saying, "I'm not going to let go until you bless me." And I think that our reading of Ezekiel 17 through 24 is going to require that sort of perseverance, that sort of attitude and willingness to wrestle, not with the goal of dismissing the text, not even with the goal of figuring out what's interesting in the text, but with the explicit goal of finding a blessing in the text. And so I hope that as you read these chapters, and some of them are really hard to read, that you will keep in mind this idea of blessing. And as you encounter these difficulties in Ezekiel 17 through 24, I ask that, and I hope that you'll turn those into a prayer. God, I'm not going to stop wrestling with this text until you bless me, until you give me a blessing. Maybe it's a word, maybe it's a phrase, maybe it's an idea, but what is the blessing that you're given? As I did with the Before You Read lecture for chapters 8 through 16, I want to highlight just a few themes that we see in these chapters. And then for the reading strategy, rather than a set of questions, this week I want to give you a set of focus texts, so a few places to dabble and to think along with the prophet Ezekiel. So the first theme in these chapters that became apparent to me is Ezekiel's language about his language, right? There is the mention of allegory and riddle. All of this suggests that the language of Ezekiel 17 through 24 is non-literal. It is symbolic, it's metaphorical, it is doing work using images and language. And so that's something to pay attention to. How do we make sense of this as interpreters if it's allegorical or metaphorical or even symbolic language? What would that do with those rough edges of the text if we say, what is this symbolizing? Maybe instead of what does it literally denote or mean? A second thing that I would highlight as a theme in these chapters is the way in which Ezekiel's prophetic message blends a concern about what I would call ritual impropriety and moral failings. So the world of religion and ethics are intermixed in a number of these messages. So on the one hand, Ezekiel will be concerned with things that we might see in the Decalogue or in Leviticus that are about worship or proper containment of bodily fluids and these sorts of things. But there's also a great interest in how Israel is treating the least among them, about how money is being lent or not lent, about what is happening to prisoners and so forth. So pay attention to the blending of the ritual and the ethical in these prophetic messages. A third theme that I saw throughout these chapters concerns reversal and transformation. Reversal is pretty self-explanatory. We see this in Isaiah, we see this in Mary's Magnificat in Luke's Gospel. The basic is that which is high will be brought low, and that which is low will be brought up. Ezekiel trades in this notion of reversal in several places in these chapters. Transformation is related, but perhaps of a different sort. We might even use one of the words that appears a couple of times in these chapters, which is transplant. So how is transplanting happening? It seems as though transplanting for Ezekiel in these chapters is a good thing, or at least a productive thing. So pay attention to reversal and transformation. A final thing really that is focused especially on chapter 23, but also some of the violent language in early chapters. And that is simply that this material is a bit R-rated. I doubt that you'll see much of Ezekiel 17 through 24 in a children's Bible. It certainly is a troubling part. The violence, the depiction of violence, the threat of violence. And then chapter 23, which draws, as we saw in chapter 16, on sexual violence and sexual impropriety that is met with physical violence and shame. These are hard chapters in many cases, and they might come with a parental advisory sticker on them if they were a CD or an album. For the reading strategies, as I mentioned earlier, I want to point out just a couple of things that I think might be places for us to dig in for our time together as a group. The first is pay attention to the image of God as a planter at the end of chapter 17, right around verses 22 through 24. A second place that I think is really, really important is at the end of chapter 18, verses 25 and following, where God enters into this sort of contest with the people of Israel around the question of God's fairness. Is God fair? I think this is a fundamentally important question for Ezekiel, but also for other parts of the Bible. A third place that you might pay attention to is chapter 20, which is this history of rebellion. There are these historical resumes elsewhere in the Bible, and here is one in which Ezekiel's message sort of goes through the history of Israel, illustrating that it is one of rebellion, and yet God displays an interesting and important reluctance to act, to judge, to dismiss, and that might be an important place for us to dig in. Then in chapter 22, we get another image of God. If earlier we saw God as a planter, here we see God as a smelter, one who mixes metals in chapter 22. And we might especially wonder about this transformative nature of smelting, of melting metals down to their essence to eliminate anything that would be impure, that it might be transformed into something different. That might be a place for us to focus. And finally, I've already mentioned chapter 23. It's an echo of chapter 16, which is a troubling part of Ezekiel. Here in chapter 23, the depiction of two cities, Samaria and Jerusalem, as sexually immoral women, as prostitutes, or pardon the word, whores, as the language is translated in the NRSV, is troubling for so many reasons. The assumptions that it makes about women and their bodies, the threats of violence, both physical and sexual, and the shaming that is done, I think really raises the questions of the limits of metaphor, the limits of this allegorical or symbolic language. And we might consider the real world consequences of this kind of language as we encounter it in chapter 23. Like I said at the beginning, Ezekiel 17 through 24 has some troubling language. It will give us much to wrestle with. But I pray as you prayerfully and as you diligently engage this material, that you'll see it as a wrestling match, that you will be blessed for having wrestled with the text, for having asked questions and explored how this text is making you feel and why it's making you feel, and how it's teaching you about God, or how it's encouraging you to consider what you know and think about God. So may you be blessed as you read this text, as you wrestle with this text, and I'm confident that we will have a rich conversation when we are together. Happy reading.